Well, this is the final sermon on the 7 deadly sins, and as I was preparing it, it took me back to a quote by Fyodor Dostoevsky in his remarkable novel, The Brothers Karamazov. And Dostoevsky wrote, "Do you think it is a vain hope that one day man will find joy in noble deeds of light and mercy, rather than in the coarse pleasures he indulges in today? Gluttony, fornication, ostentation, boasting, and envious vying with his neighbor. I am certain this is not a vain hope, and that the day will come soon." I hope and pray that day comes sooner rather than later. Well, today we are reflecting on some difficult topics: lust, adultery, and divorce. And these are painful topics for some of us because of our own experiences or because of what we're going through right now. And while it may be difficult for some of us to hear, I pray that something that I share this morning might be helpful. So let's begin in the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount in verse 27, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman for the purpose of lusting after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." There is more in these 5 verses than I can possibly deal with in 20 minutes, but I'm going to try to touch on some of it. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus repeatedly refers back to the 10 Commandments. And he does so here when he says, "You shall not commit adultery." And the people listening to him would have thought, "I've heard that commandment since I was a kid in synagogue school." What they hadn't heard was what he said next. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman for the purpose of lusting after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And that's when folks turned to one another and said, "I'm in big trouble." And Jesus' point is that just because you don't commit adultery with a certain person doesn't mean that your relationship with that person in the area of sexuality is what it should be, or that you are what you ought to be when it comes to sexuality. Because our heart can be far from the kingdom of God in this regard, even if we've never committed adultery. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, adultery had a very precise definition. It was sexual relations between a married or engaged woman and any man other than her husband. So adultery, therefore, was only committed against the husband and never against the wife. It was considered a grievous transgression to be punished even by death of both persons involved. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 22. The threat of execution apparently still existed all the way into the 1st century, as we see in a very well-known story of Jesus and a woman who was caught in adultery in John chapter 7 into the beginning of chapter 8. Now, the law was probably intended to ensure that any child born to the wife was the husband's child. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus broadens the definition of adultery, saying the husband could also be held responsible for committing adultery against his wife. You have to remember that back in the time of Moses, a wife was viewed as property belonging to her husband. And this is reflected in the 10th commandment, about not coveting anything that belongs to your neighbor's household, beginning with his wife. And the Hebrew word for covet implies intentional planning to obtain something for yourself. And as we heard in the story of David and Bathsheba, the smoke of lust often leads to a destructive fire that leaves lives and relationships in ashes. There's so much that's wrong with King David in that brief passage. It's the time of the year when kings go off to war, and he doesn't go off to war and battle with his men. He stays at home. He looks at someone, lusts after her, finds out who she is, and then even though he finds out she's married to one of his most trusted officers, takes her and rapes her anyway. And then when he finds out that he got her pregnant, he tries to bring Uriah home to cover his own sin, and Uriah has so much integrity he won't even sleep with his wife while his men are still out fighting in the field. And then the rest of the story, you may know, is that when David can't get Uriah to be with his wife, he sends him back to the front carrying the very orders to put him at the forefront of the men where he'll be killed. So when you talk about how one act of lust leaves an incredible trail of destruction, David illustrates it. And the vice of lust reduces sexual desire to selfishness, as with King David and many others who have followed a similar path. Sexual desire and the sexual acts that express it appropriately are meant to serve life and to be a sign of self-giving love. Lust, on the other hand, expresses disrespect for others and generates shame for ourselves. And lust contributes greatly to the sin of human trafficking, which is a huge problem all across our country and even right here on Cape Cod. And it entraps untold numbers of vulnerable victims, many of them minors. Lust promises pleasure long enough to get us hooked, which gives it power, but in the end, the habit of lust hinders our ability to love and to be loved. And what Jesus is prohibiting in Matthew chapter 5 is not just forming a plan for seducing your neighbor's wife or husband, but the mental act of lusting after him or her in the first place. And just as anger is the root that leads to murder, lust can lead to adultery. And it's important to understand that it's not a sin for us to notice another person. It's what we do next. Jesus warns against looking at a woman for the purpose of lusting after her. And in the early church, women were to be welcomed as sisters. Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, that he is to speak to older women as mothers and to younger women as sisters with absolute purity. And in our time, the need for self-discipline and purity is part of every believer's life. But because we live in the age of the internet and movies and television, we have far more access to temptation in this area regarding our sexual behavior than people did in the past. When I was trying to think as I worked on this sermon, I'm trying to think of our teenagers and what are they facing now? When I was becoming a teenager, the raciest show on television was Charlie's Angels. Okay? If you were to look at Charlie's Angels today compared to the programming that's on, it would look like the Waltons, or a Hallmark movie compared to what is out there today. And we all know that sex is used to sell virtually every single product under the sun, from alcohol to cars to personal care products, you name it. Temptation is everywhere. And there's an excellent description of how we fall into sexual temptation and also how we don't do that in Job chapter 31, where Job shares how he maintained his integrity. And I've got this passage, I think, for you for the screen. In Job 31, he says, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. If I have walked with falsehood, or my foot has hurried after deceit, if my steps have turned from the path, if my heart has been led by my eyes, or if my hands have been defiled, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, that would have been wicked, a sin to be judged. It is a fire that burns to destruction. Job accurately describes how adultery or other inappropriate sexual relationships begin with the lust of our eyes,